Kayle Barrington Bates was executed in Florida on August 19, 2025, after more than 40 years on death row. In this video, we'll go through the brutal crime, the decades of court battles, his last meal, and his final words. It was June 14, 1982, in Lynn Haven, Florida. For the 24-year-old Janet Renee White, it began like any other Monday. She wasn't just an office manager, she was a wife, deeply in love. She had married Randy White just 10 weeks after meeting him, and by 1982, they had already spent 8 years together, still living like newlyweds. That afternoon, the two of them met for lunch at their home. Randy made her a sandwich while she watched her favorite soap opera. When it was time to return to work, Randy didn't just let her leave. He followed her in his car, making sure she got back safely. He waited, watched her unlock the door, and kissed her goodbye at 12:55 p.m. 12 minutes later, she was gone. What Janet didn't know was that while she was at lunch, someone had already slipped into her office. That man was Kayle Barrington Bates, and he wasn't a stranger off the street. He worked as a delivery truck driver for a paper company, and Janet's office was one of his regular stops. Over time, he seemed to develop an unhealthy fixation on her. Some believe he may have even been watching her for weeks, planning the moment he'd make his move. That day, instead of making a delivery, he broke in and waited. He sat hidden inside, knowing she would return after lunch. When Janet walked back through the door, she had no idea there was danger only a few steps away. Bates confronted her, holding a knife. There was no small talk, no hesitation. He forced her out of the office, leading her away from the safety of a public space into his control. From there, he drove her to a remote wooded area outside the city, a place where the sounds of traffic and voices couldn't reach. In that isolation, the situation turned deadly. Investigators later determined she had been strangled, stabbed, and robbed. Jewelry she had been wearing, including her ring, was gone. The attack was violent and deliberate, leaving no chance for her to escape or call for help. But before that terrifying moment when Janet entered the room, the phone rang. She picked it up. On the other end was her friend, Jerry Gilchrist. They had barely exchanged greetings when Jerry suddenly heard her let out what she would later describe as a bone-chilling scream. Then came the sound of the phone hitting the floor. Muffled banging followed, signs of a violent struggle. And then, silence. Frozen in shock, Jerry quickly hung up and called the police. The break in the case came shockingly fast. Later that same day, law enforcement spotted Bates near the area where Janet's body had been found. When officers searched him, they discovered her blood on his clothing and her ring sitting in his pocket. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was physical proof tying him directly to the murder. Eyewitnesses also placed him near Janet's office around the time she disappeared. Piece by piece, the chain of evidence began to close around him, forming a picture that prosecutors would later use to argue not just for a conviction, but for the ultimate penalty. Once investigators had Janet White's blood on Bates's clothes, her ring in his pocket, and eyewitness accounts placing him near her office, there was no hesitation. He was taken into custody the very same day. From the beginning, Bates denied killing Janet. He tried to distance himself from the evidence, but the physical proof was too direct to explain away. Prosecutors built their case quickly, pointing out that the items found on him weren't just random possessions. They were taken from Janet in the final moments of her life. By the time his trial began in 1983, the prosecution's strategy was clear. Present a straightforward, airtight narrative showing the timeline from the moment he entered her office to the moment police found him. The defense faced an uphill battle. Their attempts to suggest there might be another explanation for the evidence didn't land with the jury. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, attempted sexual battery, and armed robbery. Then came the sentencing phase, and the jurors didn't hesitate. They recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed, sentencing Bates to die by lethal injection. What no one knew at that moment was that the execution would be delayed for more than 4 decades as the case became tangled in a long series of appeals and resentencing hearings. After the 1983 conviction, most people expected the sentence to be carried out within a few years, but Bates's case was only just beginning to wind its way through the legal maze. His attorneys filed appeal after appeal, arguing that errors had been made during his trial. The first major break for the defense came more than a decade later. In the mid-1990s, a higher court ordered a new sentencing hearing, citing procedural issues. For Janet White's family, it meant reliving the crime all over again, facing the same man in court, listening to the same details, as if time hadn't moved forward at all. The resentencing happened in 1995. Prosecutors brought back the same core evidence: the ring in his pocket, the blood on his clothes, the eyewitnesses. The jury heard the facts, deliberated, and once again recommended death. The judge upheld the sentence, but Bates wasn't finished. His legal team continued filing motions, claiming juror bias, ineffective counsel, and, years later, raising arguments about brain damage and mental illness. His attorneys pointed to evaluations from a forensic neuropsychologist, Dr. Barry Crown, who concluded that Bates had organic brain damage that impaired his ability to think clearly and respond under stress. They argued this evidence could have been used as powerful mitigation if it had been fully presented to the jury. These new claims painted a picture of a troubled background, but they were presented decades after the trial, and the courts largely rejected them as coming too late or lacking the kind of proof needed to overturn the sentence. Judges also noted that other mental health experts had testified during the earlier proceedings and ruled that any additional testimony would have been cumulative, not enough to change the outcome. Each time a motion was denied, another would follow. The case shifted from the evidence of the crime itself to questions about process, representation, and constitutional rights. For the victim's family, every new filing meant another delay, another letter from the state telling them the execution wasn't happening anytime soon. By the time the 2000s rolled into the 2010, the case had become one of Florida's longest-running death penalty sagas, and still, no execution date had been set. It wasn't until 2025 that things began to move again, and this time it moved fast. By early 2025, the legal roadblocks that had kept Kayle Barrington Bates alive for more than 4 decades were nearly gone. One by one, his pending appeals had been denied. The most decisive blow came in June, when the US Supreme Court refused to hear his case. That single decision meant there was nothing left between him and an execution date. Florida's Attorney General wasted no time, urging the governor to set the process in motion. The argument was simple. The courts had reviewed the case for over 40 years, and every verdict and sentence had been upheld. It was time, they said, to deliver what the jury decided back in 1983 and confirmed again in 1995. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant soon after. The state chose August 19, 2025, as the date Bates would be put to death by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. The announcement marked him as the 10th execution in Florida that year, a pace the state hadn't seen in decades. For Janet White's family, the date carried a strange mix of emotions: relief that the end was finally in sight, and exhaustion from the decades-long ordeal of hearings, appeals, and delays. For Bates, it meant the countdown had begun, and every remaining day would bring him closer to the gurney. The case had moved from a crime scene to a death row cell, and now, after so many years, it was headed toward its final chapter. On the morning of August 19, 2025, security at Florida State Prison in Rayford was tight. The clock was running on Kayle Barrington Bates's final hours. Outside the prison, a small group gathered, some there to protest the death penalty, others to support the execution. Inside, everything moved according to a precise schedule the state had followed many times before. Bates spent the morning under constant supervision. As with all executions in Florida, he was allowed a final meal of his choice. He turned down a last meal, even from the standard prison menu, and declined a spiritual advisor. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain rose. He was strapped to the gurney. When asked for any final words, he said nothing, choosing silence over a last statement, a right afforded to all death row inmates before execution. Moments later, a lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. His chest rose once, then fell. Within minutes, he was pronounced dead. For more than 4 decades, the name Kayle Barrington Bates stayed tied to one of Florida's most brutal murder cases. The evidence against him was direct, the verdict was repeated twice, and yet the legal process stretched across generations. To Randy White, Janet wasn't just a name in a decades-old case. She was his wife, his best friend, the person who filled every corner of his life with energy, curiosity, and joy. She always wanted to be somebody, Randy said. To me, she already was. After her murder, Randy's world crumbled. It destroyed me, he said. I thought, I'm done. I'm not going to bring a child into the world. The future they'd imagined was gone. For years, he spiraled into grief, addiction, and silence. But eventually, he found his way back. He got clean, rebuilt his life. He remarried Jennifer White, his wife of 29 years, and found steady ground again. Still, the hole Janet left never really closed. People tell me, you're just depressed, but I don't see it that way. It's loneliness. I'm always going to be lonely for her. Now, 43 years later, Randy says he can finally close one part of the story. At least this part I can leave behind. I won't think of it again. I can be done with it, but I'll never get past it. I'll carry that until my last breath. For Janet White's family, the execution marked the end of a very long wait. But for others, it reignited questions about the death penalty, especially when it takes this long to carry out. Does justice lose its weight when it's delayed for decades? Or is it still justice no matter how much time has passed? What do you think about this case? Was the state right to go forward after all these years? And do you believe executions should happen faster once a sentence is given? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear where you stand on this.